Cold War. We're going to be introduced to a certain individual for the first time. You'll hear a lot about him later. I hope all of you have heard about him. He later became President of the United States. Your book opens up with a vignette about a woman who ran against him when he was young. And Nixon ran against two women during his on his way to the presidency. And he proved to be an extremely dirty campaigner. He won his elections in his younger days by accusing his opponents of being communist. In the case of Helen Douglas, that was easy to do because she had wanted the United States to cooperate with the Soviet Union. As a young woman, she'd had ties to liberal organizations. So she served in Congress, but in 1950, she had the bad misfortune of running against Richard Nixon. Do I have, where's that? Okay, everybody has circled this. All right. No, she had the bad misfortune of running against Richard Nixon. Nixon called her a communist. Years later, Nixon was reported to have said, I knew all along she was not a communist, but hey, I had an election to win. Yeah, anything to get elected. And Richard Nixon continued this anything to get elected business all the way up till he was finally forced to resign the presidency. But anyway, for a war that we hoped would end all wars, another war began almost immediately. It's a war known as the Cold War. The Cold War began in 1945. It began over disputes over Eastern Europe. Now, what I mean by Eastern Europe, I'm talking about Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, East Germany, Macedonia. These countries that had the misfortune of being too close to the Soviet Union, and they had communism forced on them when the war was over. Now, the Soviet Union wanted Germany to pay for the damage it had done, and keep in mind the Soviet Union had been damaged heavily. The United States said, no, we tried that in the last war, we're not going to do it. The United States said, we would help rebuild these nations. Now, another thing that Stalin was upset about, when the United States went in to rebuild Europe, they left the Soviet Union out. They said, you are helping your enemies. They said, not helping us. The United States started to rebuild Germany and Japan and Italy. Stalin overlooked the fact that we had given him tons and tons and tons of ammunition, tanks, airplanes, rifles, artillery, to help him fight the Germans, and which they have never paid us back. Tons of heavy equipment that we gave the Soviet Union, but you're not helping us. Maybe if you behaved yourself better, we would, but that's something else. Anyway, now there's another term that we hear a lot at this time. Churchill was voted out of office by his people. So another prime minister took over. As Churchill toured the United States, he spoke at various colleges, and in one of his speeches he said, an iron curtain. An iron curtain has descended over Europe. The Iron Curtain referred to the countries that the Soviets had taken over, the countries under communism. In other words, the ones I just named. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Albania, Macedonia, these countries. These, again, Stalin's reasoning, and I can understand Stalin's reasoning, said, we need to have some countries that buffer us between us and Germany, because keep in mind, Russia had fought two big wars against Germany. And they said, we need to have a buffer state. So Stalin used that as an excuse to take over Eastern Europe. Well, Cold War. Your book says that Harry Truman had had little experience in foreign affairs, and in a lot of cases this was true. Truman had never been to college, but he had studied American history. He was very familiar with all the presidents, having read all the books he could find in the Library of Congress. I mean, not all, but a lot of books about the presidents. He was very familiar with the presidents, knew them every one by name. All of you know there was only one living former president, Herbert Hoover by name, but during the time Truman was in office, there was only one living president. Now, the United States was supporting dictatorships in Latin America, and Stalin said, well, hey, you're supporting dictators, how come you're criticizing us when we support dictatorships? Well, basically because you're evil, and we're trying to do what's best for Latin Americans. But anyway, this is what people do to you when you have to associate with a man like Stalin. They're always pointing out your own faults and using your faults as justification for theirs. I must say this, during one of his tours, Churchill toured the United States, he spoke at a graduation ceremony, and he spent some 20 minutes telling the college students over and over again, never give up. Don't ever, ever give up. Never give up. Over and over. He figured those students would remember that the rest of their lives. I guess most of them did. Just 3 words, never give up. He could say that. He hadn't given up. Now, Stalin forced communism on Poland and Bulgaria, then later on Hungary, and finally forced communism on Czechoslovakia, which had been a democratic country. It was the last of those Iron Curtain countries that was democratic. Stalin went around and killed a lot of the leaders of these countries who opposed him. And Roosevelt was taken aback and said, well, who's he going to kill next? Now, Germany. In the case of Germany, I've already mentioned how that the United States has stopped his advance through Germany and basically let the Soviets have a lot of East Germany. I'm going to draw a little crude map. Let's say this is Germany. The Allies divided Germany into four parts. The United States took a part, France took a part, Great Britain took a part, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union took a part of it. These 3 countries got together and said, we're going to unite them, but the United States and France and Britain still kept troops in Germany. But the USSR would not cooperate, and in the meantime, inside the USSR territory, inside East Germany, this became West Germany. The United States and French and British became West Germany. This became East Germany. Berlin was also divided into 4 parts, with the United States and France and Britain forming West Berlin, and the Soviet Union forming East Berlin. Now this was to lead to the building of the Berlin Wall later, and this was to lead to all kinds of conflicts. But Berlin was a city inside East Berlin. Well, now, the United States, realizing how good Germany was with industry, wanted Germany to industrialize. So they encouraged the German people to industrialize. But the East Germans were told not to, so East Germany lagged behind. Now eventually, East Germany and West Germany were able to unite. Both sides wanted to disarm Germany, just like did Japan. So in the meantime, the United States went into Japan and destroyed all of Japan's war-making ability, smashed up 4,000 airplanes, making sure Japan would not make another war. Later we realized this might have been a big waste because the Japanese planes were for the most part well built, but And in the meantime, we disarmed Germany also, and then that was in 1945. In 1955, we armed Germany again. Now, your book doesn't mention this, but we went into Germany and practiced what we called denazification, where we went in and rounded up all the Nazis we could find and tried them for war crimes, particularly crimes against the Jews. The atrocities that were being committed against the Jews were not believed by most people outside until the Soviet Union bumped into a concentration camp before the Germans could cover it up. And then the whole world was exposed to it. And eventually American soldiers also saw concentration camps. And it said these hardened war veterans who'd seen a lot of bad sights were moved to tears at what they saw. The horrors of people who were beaten and starved to death, broken down with diseases, and whose minds were shot, neither dead nor alive, but in some state in between death and living. I've seen videos of it, pictures of it, and it is horrible. They made a mayor and his wife go to a German mayor and his German mayor go to a concentration camp one day. The next day they found the mayor and his wife had hung themselves in their home. The German people were unaware of what was going on inside the camps. One time they told the whole town, all of you from 18 and above, you go to the camp. And the Germans thought it was a big joke. I mean, they knew the Allies had taken over the city, but they still had they went to the camp laughing up a storm and came out crying their eyes out, having no idea the horrors that they found inside. And the United States would not let the Jews in. This is the only Western nation that did was the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic was small, only let a few of them in. The United States would not, even though the news of the Holocaust reached the outside that, this is just an exaggeration of the war. I mean, people tend to exaggerate. Nothing like this is going on. I found it was worse than what they were told. Anyway, just another term you'll hear a lot is in this few chapters is containment. We're going to contain communism where it already is and try to not let it expand any farther than it already has. Containment. It was similar to what Lincoln had said before while he was running for president in 1860. He said, I will allow slavery to exist where it already exists, but I won't let it expand outside of where it exists already. Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson tried the same thing, policy of let's contain communism where it is. The Truman Doctrine gave aid to Greece and Turkey. Now, the purpose of that was it was feared that Greece and Turkey would be taken over by the communists. After all, Greece was located right next to the countries that were already behind the Iron Curtain. And Turkey was located right next to the Soviet Union itself, even though there was very little danger that, this has been emphasized by every history book, very little danger that either country would become communist. And I've got to say this about Turkey was a Muslim country. Muslim countries have not very many of them gone communist. In fact, I don't think any of them have. And there's a reason for that. While both Islam and communism want absolute control over the population, they have one big, big difference. And that big difference is communism teaches that there is no God, and Islam is convinced there is one. And they'll probably never get together over that one issue. So the two sides have, but anyway, Truman, there was a big fear going around that if Greece and Turkey falls, it'll create a lot of chaos, and the rest of Europe will be thrown into chaos. So we've got to contain them and not let them have Greece and Turkey, even though Greece and Turkey were not actually about to go to communist. Now, The Marshall Plan. Oh yeah, you run into this Marshall Plan. Was set up to rebuild Europe. Now, the project of rebuilding Europe was to take many, many decades. When I was in elementary school, a lot of Germany still lay in ruins, having been bombed, and the buildings, the brickwork was still collapsed. And every week or so, some World War II body is discovered, either in a field where it's been abandoned for many years, or inside a building that they finally decided to get a bulldozer in and pull up the bricks and put a new building there. Europe is still being repaired. When I was a kid, our teacher said there were a lot of tanks still sitting in the fields where they've been blown up that were too heavy to move. But now, over time, these tanks, we have heavier equipment than we once did. These tanks have now been picked up on the back of trucks, and most of it. But there are still tank yards in Germany. I mean, in Europe, where the tanks have not been removed. Just places that are abandoned tanks that are now rusted and beyond any type of repair, any type of restoration. But they're still there. But World War II vets, dead ones, are getting to come home all the time. Sometimes they're identified because they still have attached to their skeletons a dog tag that tells who they were. And also DNA. That was something we didn't have then, a DNA test to known relatives. Now, in my case, my dad's brother took off from Italy on a bombing mission. He was on a B-24 airplane. Took off on a bombing mission. The date was November 15th, 1944. The plane left at 8 o'clock in the morning. Never seen, never heard from again. Officially, the War Department told my granddad, "We think his plane fell into the Adriatic Sea." Planes are being found at the bottom of the sea all the time these days. If they ever find his plane, they'll come looking for me. I'm his nearest living relative. My Uncle Calvin Cunningham was on that plane. Nobody else, nobody on the plane was ever heard from again. Plane vanished. Likely fell into the Adriatic Sea. Again, if you look on the map where he started from in Italy, he had traveled for several miles over the sea before he got, and of course, if his plane would have hit the Alps in Austria or Switzerland, likely it would have been found by now. Even though that's not necessarily true, but likely it would have been found by now. But anyway, now, eventually, inevitably, the Soviet Union decided, we're going to blockade Berlin. We're not going to allow your trucks to come in. So they set up blockades and wouldn't allow trains and trucks to move into the city of Berlin. Harry Truman and Great Britain responded by what's called the Berlin Airlift. Where they sent airplanes, and Stalin did not want to risk another war by shooting down the planes, so the planes from this part of Germany and this part of Germany flew in daily, flew in and bought food and medical supplies and essentials into West Berlin. The airlift was the first direct confrontation between the United States and Soviet Union in the Cold War. And it ended in something that was a victory for the United States. And that's not to say the United States always won its bouts with the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, eventually the Soviet Union realized that their blockade was not working, so they finally agreed to lift the blockade and let trucks in and let trains in. And it was a victory for the United States. The Berlin airlift lasted about a year or two. All right. There was, 1949, the year I was born. I was, of course, unaware of it. There were some shocks that occurred in 1949. One of the shocks that occurred was that China went communist. Mao Zedong defeated Chiang Kai-shek and forced Chiang Kai-shek to flee to the island of Formosa with 4 million of his troops. And Those troops are mostly dead by now, but their descendants are still there. But the island of Formosa is still a friendly territory to the United States. And the United States has promised military protection to Formosa. If China ever invaded Formosa, nobody knows how it happened. But anyway, the other shock of 1949 was that was the year the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. Bad news. How'd they do it? Several men, it is believed, gave secrets, atomic secrets, to the Soviet Union. Whittaker Chambers, and a couple, the Rosenbergs. Now, this Rosenberg case was something that was talked about for a long time. By today's standards, folk, there was not enough evidence to convict the Rosenbergs of treason and execute them. The Rosenbergs were tried and convicted of treason, and they were executed. But later, when we became friends with the Soviet Union in 1990, some high-up people in Russia told us we really did get a lot of help from the Rosenbergs, and without them it would have taken us much longer to build the atomic bomb. They really did help us. That came straight from the horse's mouth, you might say. But anyway, the Rosenbergs were convicted, executed. It has been said that they sent the secrets inside a pumpkin, and they would put the pumpkin in a shipment of other pumpkins, but the Soviet Union knew which pumpkin to break open, and inside that pumpkin would be atomic secrets. Anyway, they were convicted, executed. The United States set up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which still exists, to try to contain communism. The communists responded by setting up the Warsaw Pact, which I won't write down. The Warsaw Pact consisted of Iron Curtain countries that were, basically Europe became divided into two camps. NATO has been joined by the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Scandinavian countries, and Turkey and Greece, Italy. These are North NATO members. In addition, to fight communism, the CIA was set up, which still exists. The Central Intelligence Agency tries to bribe people from other countries into telling what they know, bribe them, pay them, coerce them, any way they can get people to talk, convince them that our way is better. Now, backing up a little bit, what could have impelled some of these people to side and give the Russians our secrets? And I think a lot of it, folk, has to do with this one issue, the issue of God. If you don't believe there's a God, then you're more like the Russians were than you are like the United States. And if you don't want to have God in your life, well, hey, why not side with a communist? I think it had a lot to do with it. But also, when I was young, and to some extent this is still true, a lot of the professors in colleges were communists. Communism has an appeal to a lot of people. And in 1989, a woman communist professor and I wrote a book about how great the Soviet Union was. And in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. Proved not to be great at all. But again, a lot of times your higher ups will get this affinity for the other side. Hey, these people, well, you think we are so flawed over here, but those people, they don't have any of the problems we have. Yes, they do, and oftentimes their problems are worse than yours. But you can see your problems. It was like McClellan at the Battle of Antietam. He saw his men being killed and maimed, and all thought this was terrible. Oh man, he didn't know how much damage his men were doing to the enemy. Got up the next day and found the enemy was gone. Hey, I thought we were being whipped. No, the enemy was being whipped. But again, you can see your own side and see their flaw. There's an old saying, the grass looks greener on the other side. Yes, it does, until you cross the fence. Oops. The grass was greener where I came from. Better get back over. Again, look at a field. The grass will look really green on the other side of the fence. because you're looking at it from a different angle. You can see the flaws in the grass underneath you. Get over there and look back, and your grass will all of a sudden look green, and the grass you're on, it's not as green as it looked. All right. The United States exploded a hydrogen bomb shortly after the Soviet Union exploded its atomic bomb. Well, the Soviet Union exploded a hydrogen bomb shortly afterward. And who taught the Soviet Union how to build a hydrogen bomb? The United States. Now, I must say this, it wasn't all the United States betrayers. As World War II was being lost, German scientists began to defect toward the east and west. One of the most famous defectors was a rocket scientist named Wernher von Braun. None of you might have heard of, but he was sometimes they call him Wernher von Braun. He helped us get to the moon. But he was the best rocket scientist of his day. Unfortunately, Wernher von Braun's past was checkered. He had taken part in some atrocities as a Nazi and had killed a lot of innocent people. Nevertheless, we welcomed him with open arms, and we began to tell the Russians, our German scientists are better than your German scientists, which was partly true. Our German scientists were better and enabled us to get ahead. But now, I want to remind you of something, folks. I'm talking right at this moment, we have no way to get to the space station except using Russian rockets. Some of you might not be aware of that, but we don't have the shuttle anymore. We have to depend, and we have to pay $20 million a man. Guess what? The Russians can use that money to hire better engineers and to get better equipment. Yes, they can. That's a good bit of money. It adds up as we keep sending our men up into the space station using their rockets. Yes, we do. We have been doing that now for 7 or 8 years, ever since we retired the space shuttle. Now we're working on, our men are working on SpaceX, working hard to get a rocket. But it's like anything else. You put this thing together and it never works right the first time. And it never works right the second time. And it doesn't work right the third time either. And every time the men say we're going to get it ready, oops, we got to delay it. Something didn't work. Got to delay it. I put together gadgets myself. And I know how hard it is to get them to work sometimes. All right. The United States became involved in foreign affairs, and isolationism was a thing of the past. The United States helped Japan to recover from the war quickly. Japan set up a constitution that outlawed war. In the meantime, something else Truman did. I'm going to try to draw a map here of Palestine. In those days it was called Palestine. This being like the Dead Sea and this being the Sea of Galilee, or anyway, this is a crude map. Now, Palestine was an Arab territory. All right, that's true. But the Jews had begun occupying places in Palestine that the Palestinians were not using. Well, after the Holocaust, the United Nations said, hey, well, we really ought to give these Jews a homeland. So the UN met and they voted to partition, where the Jews would only use land that they were already living on, and the rest of the land would still be Arab land. The UN voted overwhelmingly to give it. Now, Latin America voted for the partition. The United States voted for partition. Of all people, Stalin, the Soviet Union, voted for partition. China voted for the partition. Britain and France voted for the partition. Germany, to try to make amends, voted for the partition. Who voted against it? Israel's neighbors, the Middle Eastern countries, but they were outvoted. As soon as a vote was taken, Israel said to its neighbors, hey, we welcome you in peace, we come in peace. The Arabs said, we're going to drive you into the sea. So the Arabs mounted their weapons and began to try to drive into the sea. President Harry Truman was persuaded by one of his staff, hey, support Israel. Truman did, and Israel has survived to this day. What happened, though, instead of Israel keeping the land that they originally were given, the Jordanians fled and set themselves up in camps. And this has created a refugee problem that was to last for a good many years and still goes on today. But again, it was a problem of the Palestinians' own making. Now, I want to remind you, folks, of a couple of things. Some of you have said that we should give the land that we took from the Indians back to them. Every human being that's lived on this earth for the last 2,000 years is living on land that either he or his ancestors took from someone else. The Arabs at one point took that land from other people. Then they say once it's ours, it stays ours. But folk, if you ever buy a house, you're going to have to buy one that was once owned by someone else or once lived in. Or if you even buy a brand new house, the land was once occupied by someone else. The house I'm living in was once occupied by a family named Sawyers, a man and wife, just a couple. They left. They couldn't pay the payment, so they upped and left in the middle of the night one day, and nobody knew. I still get mail from them after 10 years or more. Still get their mail. All right, point I'm making is, no other nation was ever created more legally than the nation of Israel was. The whole world body, such as was voted to give them the land. Now, I've been asked, what benefit have we received by helping Israel? I'll tell you what benefit we received. The Arabs got their weapons from the Soviet Union. Israel got its weapons from the United States. When the wars occurred in 1948, 1956, and 1967 and 1973, American-made weapons blew the Russian-made weapons off the battlefield. Did that benefit the United States? Believe me, that's one of the things that made the Russians afraid to go to war with us. Our equipment was better. Now, that does not apply to 2019 necessarily, now, folk. But it did apply during I had a teacher at Lockheed say, if they're so much more powerful, how did they just come in and take over us? I'll tell you why they didn't. Their weapons were not as good as ours. But that might not apply to today. But it did apply. Their weapon, the Israeli troops actually got those Arabs to running pell-mell. They'd take off their boots and run pell-mell through the sand to get away from the Israeli machinery, machine gun fire. Again, the Jews were using American-made weapons. All right. Anyway, Harry Truman began the process of helping the Israelis. And the United States has prospered ever since. That's more perhaps spiritual than it is history, but each of you can decide for yourself what you believe about it. All right, now during this time, a lot of small countries received their independence from big Western countries. The United States gave the Philippines its independence. The date was July 4th, 1946. Puerto Rico didn't want to break from the United States. We still have Puerto Rico. We still have Wake Island, Guam, and Samoa, all these countries. But in the meantime, Great Britain gave its independence to Jamaica. The Dutch gave their independence to Indonesia. European countries got rid of colonies. The French were forced to give up Vietnam. The Algerians also drove the French out. The Congo, Belgium gave up the Congo. Portugal gave up Angola. Now, why did these European countries were probably so willing to give up their? And I know I'm running out of time. Why are they so here? And I'll say this and give you a break. The European countries had worked so hard to defeat Nazi Germany and so hard to defeat fascist Italy, so hard to defeat socialism, and once the war was over, they raced headlong into socialism. Here's the problem. The European countries, 90% of the wealth was right there in Europe, and a little bit from their colonies. The Europeans did not want to share their wealth with their poor colonies, so they said, okay, you go on your own. Otherwise, to be truly socialist, a Europe like little Belgium was not capable of feeding every Congo man. And Portugal was not capable of feeding every Angolan. And the Dutch, small Holland, was not capable of feeding Indonesia. Indonesia has the 5th most populous country in the world, behind the United States, China, Russia, India, and then Indonesia. Belgium, Holland was not capable of feeding those Indonesians. So that was one reason they're anxious to get rid of them. Let them go their own way. And in the meantime, they felt like we can embrace socialism. Okay, well, by my watch.